members to approve the budget in anticipation of certification by the Multnomah County Tax Supervising and Conservation Commission, which is TSCC, on June 7th. Let me move on to the agenda. Oops. All right, so this is our agenda for today. We'll start off our presentation with Jim Middaugh presenting the Executive Director's budget message. Then we'll take a look at potential impacts of the proposed budget on our legacy districts that should be considered as we go through our budget process. We'll also take a look at projections for ending operating fund balances in each of our districts. And I'll be reviewing the proposed budget summary and walking you through materials and services that have been included in the budget. We'll take a look at the ending fund balance for the urban district and review proposed staffing support for the upcoming fiscal year. And finally, we'll review options for your consideration and take a look at our next steps in the process. So now I'm going to hand things over to Jim for our presentation of the budget message.
Unmute and now get my notes. Thank you for your patience. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for donating some of your valuable time to us today. I want to start by just reflecting on the fact that it really is an honor and a privilege to be before you today to introduce your proposed fiscal year 23-24 budget for the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District. And, you know, it's a true honor and privilege for a bunch of reasons, but a few that I reflect on really regularly is that among the reasons is that our community really does face some increasing flood risk from climate change and an aging flood safety system, but together we have the opportunity to really reduce that risk. Another reason is that in reducing flood risk, we also have an opportunity to reduce the cost of the governance of our system and to make our governance of the system more representative of our community. And that's an opportunity that doesn't come around very often. And still another is that we have an opportunity to do our flood safety work going forward in a way that supports our community's strong desire for us to do flood safety work in a way that contributes to water quality and the environment, and that increases our community's resilience in the face of a changing climate. So again, the legislature and the voters have really given us a huge opportunity here. And I think it's worth noting today, given the recent news and weather, that you know, this risk is very real. And you really only need to look south a few hundred miles or back a couple of days to see the devastation that flood system failures can cause. And I just want to emphasize that your work here today and your staff's work is super important and candidly quite time sensitive. The system that you guys are beginning to govern includes 27 miles of levees, 12 pump stations, and 45 miles of sloughs, pipes, ditches, and other conveyances that move water from inside the leveed area out to the river. The construction of that system over 100 years ago allowed the area along the river to become home to $16 billion in annual economic activity, 8,000 residents, 2,500 businesses, 59,000 jobs, and a bunch of really important assets like the Portland International Airport and backup drinking water supplies for over 1 million Oregonians. It's a really important spot that we work to protect. And even though the landscape behind those levees has changed a lot in the last 100 years, the system that protects it is being operated with a century-old governance system and financial system that was really designed for an agrarian landscape. We don't have that landscape today. Operating with those antiquated systems and governance really is creating some limitations and challenges, and you're going to hear more about that today from Lori. But chief among those challenges is the need to invest millions of dollars in improvements and upgrades to meet the needs of our growing region, the impacts of climate change, and the demands of changing federal standards. And so just to be really clear, the scale of investments that we need to make to keep our community safe and fulfill our mission is really beyond the Legacy District's financial capability, which is why we're here today. I want to stress again, and I know you guys know this, that operating as 4 separate entities, and there's actually 7, is also a little bit inefficient. It's really critical right now, but it's inefficient. And the historic district's finances are really challenged in the long run because they're not even that long, and you'll hear more about that today, just because of the scale of public ownership, open space, and other land use designations along the river and in the legacy districts. So that's why this budget is really so important. It allows you to continue the work of creating a sustainable and more efficient way of operating, maintaining, and most importantly, upgrading and improving our flood safety system. And this budget, that as proposed and with your direction, will allow you, the initial board, to fulfill your statutory obligation to identify the scope and costs of ongoing and new programs and to adopt a new revenue structure to pay for them. This budget's also going to allow you to really dig into the capital investments that are needed to improve and upgrade our current system and to maintain federal certification and accreditation, and ultimately to determine whether you're comfortable referring a general obligation bond to voters to help pay for those needed investments. I want to remind you from a couple of meetings ago that staff worked hard to build this proposed budget based on a set of priorities that we shared with you and that you endorsed. And those priorities are all important, but they include protecting our employees' safety when they're out working in the field and elsewhere, really aiming to completely meet our core mission, which is flood protection and prevention, to streamline the governance by standing up the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District, to advance the Portland Metro levee system study and Federal Emergency Management Agency capital programs that we need to maintain certification and accreditation, and also to invest a little bit more in our ability to provide the support services that ensure we comply with our legal, regulatory, and policy requirements, including our new equity policies. So before I turn this over to your Director of Finance Administration, Lori Baker, I want to leave you with a sense of urgency. And as you will hear next, the need for the transition to a more resilient revenue and governance system is really growing more urgent by the day. The threats of climate change are real, and the threats of an aging system are real. We see some of our equipment wearing out on a regular basis. And those threats are growing more severe at the very same time that the legacy district's finances are becoming more and more unsustainable. And again, Lori will explain more. Just to punctuate something that you'll hear more about, current forecasts, and this started under Casey Short before I arrived on the scene and has continued till today, but current projections show that MCDD is going to be challenged to meet payroll in the fall of 2024 without some form of outside cash flow support because operating reserves are being spent down. So to help you take action as our governing body, I know that as a staff, we owe you more information. In particular, we owe you some revisions to our operating cost forecast, and we're working hard on those. Based on the progress that we've been able to make on the proposed district budgets for next fiscal year, we're going to now return our attention to incorporating your feedback about operating costs into a new operating forecast proposal. We hope to get that done in the next few weeks. And I want to make sure that you know, here's what we've heard from you and what we're working to incorporate in that revised draft. First, keep costs low, make them lower than the original forecast. Limit and or justify the growth in full-time equivalents and employees. Reduce the administrative costs on the system. And do your best to elevate and make more apparent the investment we're proposing in the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District's new mandates. So the next version of the forecast will attempt to provide all that information for you and be responsive to what we've heard from all of you. We also know there's more work to be done on collecting operating revenue. And as we shared with you at your last meeting, there are some hurdles that we're trying to get over related to implementing the fee-based approach in ORS 550. On Monday, you're going to hear from our legal counsel and outside counsel a little bit more information about some of the hurdles and challenges that we're facing in trying to come up with a cost-effective way to implement that fee-based system. It's my hope that after that presentation on Monday, we're going to be able to identify a path with you to find an operating revenue structure that's acceptable to you as the board and to our local partners across the district. And Colin will give you a little bit more update on where we stand on some of that work later on today. And finally, I want you to know that we're really clear you're interested in the capital program and the potential general obligation bond. And later today, you're going to hear our very first briefing on our initial draft thinking, can't stress that enough, about the capital program. And we really look forward as a staff to helping you guys gain a complete understanding of your options and the details of those options over the coming months, with the goal of helping you arrive at a consensus on the appropriate level of capital revenue to seek from voters sometime late summer or early fall next fiscal year. So before I hand it over, I just want to thank the finance team and all the program team folks who did a lot of hard work trying to come up with this budget and find ways to reduce costs and still get the critical work done. I want to thank the City of Portland for the ongoing line of credit that is financing a large portion of our work. And I want to thank each of you for your time, attention, and commitment to addressing the challenges we face. I know you guys are going to have some great direction and some feedback and critique of what we've proposed, and we look forward to hearing that and implementing the changes that you recommend. Just to close before I hand it over to Lori, remember the need is really great and time is growing short, and no matter what we think, the status quo is not an option. So we need to move. Thank you very much. And Lori, take it away if there are no questions for me.
All right. Thank you, Jim. So as we review the proposed budget, we would also like board members to be aware of some potential impacts on our legacy districts. We have limited resources for the urban district, and that does have implications for all of our districts. In the budget document, you'll find a new funding request from the legacy districts that will cover communications and outreach costs that extend beyond our current available resources. This $100,000 in support impacts all 4 legacy districts. Additionally, staff costs and overhead not covered by the urban budget fall to MCDD. MCDD is also facing funding challenges due to new compression impacts experienced starting in this current fiscal year and anticipated to continue going forward. Finally, any implementation costs not included in the urban appropriations will need to be covered by the legacy districts in order to keep moving on the transition to the urban district. Admittedly, this proposed budget is less than ideal, but it was our best option given limited funding available for the district. If we were to look to a common message for the budget season, it's that our temporary funding mechanisms are unsustainable. Let's take a look now at the projections for operating fund balances for our legacy districts. As we look forward to the integration of the districts into the new urban district, our fund balance projections are a good way for us to understand timelines and the importance of moving forward with the decisions facing the board. This chart shows the projected fund balances for each district as they stand right now. We're still working on those budgets for the districts, and there may be some carry forward capital that gets shifted around as we get our hands around capital projects and things that are happening this year versus next year. So these numbers may look a little bit different when I present the legacy district budgets to them, but this is where we're at this point. This shows the projected fund balances for each district. Should real life follow the numbers in the budget, which we all know as soon as we print those budgets, they're wrong, but it's our best projection as to where we're going. The information we're reviewing here aligns with the projections that were provided by our former budget director, Casey Short. For most of the districts, the numbers we need to be aware of are those dollars available for general operations. Those are our undesignated and operating reserves, which on this chart are in the blue sections. The dollars that are restricted for capital are not funds that are available for us to spend on operations. So that's why I point your attention to those blue sections as we look forward here. All right, so let's look at MCDD. The current operations are supported through drawdowns on operating fund balances. MCDD will not have enough resources in fiscal year 24-25 to continue operating at the same level that they're operating at today. Additionally, because a portion of their funds are restricted, we need to consider interim financing for operating funding, such as paying payroll for the early months of the fiscal year before assessments are collected. In general, we need around $3 million in unrestricted or operating funds to operate until assessment revenues are collected. If the actual financial results of the district align with the budget, we'll have just over $1 million in operating funds at the beginning of July 2024. Pen 1 continues to operate at a deficit, which is being covered by the City of Portland. Pen 2 is also supporting current operations using drawdowns in the operating fund balance. Pen 2 will not have enough resources in fiscal year 24-25 to continue operating at the same level they're operating at today. STIC is able to fund their operations without drawing down on their operating fund balance. However, the challenge for STIC is on the capital side, where there are over $16 million in capital costs for the replacement of the pump station in the CEIP in fiscal year 2027. And I know though that replacement is part of the Corps of Engineers project, but if we were not to move forward with a consolidation, that would be an issue for consideration for STIC. So the urban district is budgeted to spend down all of their fund balance by the end of fiscal year 2024. This fund balance information is consistent with that information that was provided by KC years previously. The transition to the urban district and implementation of new funding mechanisms will allow us to address these funding shortfalls. In your package, you'll find the proposed budget document for the urban district, and this is a summary of that budget. On the resource side of the equation, we're starting with about $260,000 of carry forward dollars in the beginning balance. This is slightly higher than we projected in that initial forecast that we presented earlier, as we've updated projections and anticipate some reduced spending through the end of fiscal year 22-23, so this current fiscal year. The proposed budget anticipates a full draw on the urban district's loan from the city, totaling $1.2 million. Looking beyond fiscal year 24, the urban district has just 2 more years of drawdowns available to support the transition period for the district. Other revenue includes $8,000 in interest earnings on funds in the local government investment pool and $100,000 in support from the legacy districts that I talked about previously. The proposed budget contemplates this support to continue to fund outreach related to the implementation of the district. Due to the difficult funding position of the urban district, where necessary costs are much higher than available funding, we're proposing some support from the legacy districts for the upcoming year. This support will need to be approved by each district and an IGA developed to cover this payment from each district. The payment is split in a manner that reflects necessary public outreach, with the districts having higher landowner populations, MCDD and Pen 2, providing $40,000 each, and those with lower populations, Pen 1 and SDIC, providing $10,000 each. Materials and services of $1.5 million represents support staffing provided by MCDD and other support as we move forward with the transition to the urban district. I'll walk through the detail on these costs on future slides. And debt service reflects the interest that's accruing on the funds borrowed. So even though we're not having to pay back on the debt at this point, we are having to record the interest cost. And this is reflective of the interest costs that will be incurred for 23-24. This slide shows the breakdown. That's weird. Okay. As we discussed on the previous slide, the urban district operations are currently funded through the borrowing on the loan from the City of Portland. This slide shows a cumulative amount of the debt by year for this borrowing. So in 2022, we had $1.2 million in liability. By the end of 2024, we're going to be up over $3.6 million. And the district is currently obligated to repay this borrowing starting in fiscal year 26-27. Okay, so this slide shows the breakdown of the proposed expenditures for fiscal year 23-24. Administrative expenses include $220,000 for election fees that will be paid to Multnomah County. This is based upon estimates that we've received from the county. Contracts and agreements reflect the cost of MCDD staff to support the transition-related activities. This amount is significantly lower than the actuals projected for the current year, but there's not enough funding available to cover any additional costs. Professional services, let me go back one. Professional services include legal costs associated with the transition, consulting fees to cover continuation of the revenue analysis being performed by Echo Northwest, communications, and community engagement. Here, this slide shows the history of the ending fund balance for the urban district. As you can see, the budget contemplates zero carry forward into the new fiscal year. There's also no contingency amount in the proposed budget. Given the limited funding available for the district, we're unable to provide for those best practice balances. So this slide summarizes the staff support that we're able to fund to support in the proposed budget. As we've discussed, this is significantly lower than the amount of staff anticipated for the current year, which is estimated at about $900,000. We're proposing that the IGA be updated to reduce the amount of direct allocation. We do have staff that are directly allocated to the urban district this year under IGA, and we're proposing to reduce that next year. We've removed the budget manager position, which is open right now, from the allocation altogether, and we've reduced the hours of the transition manager to 50%. Additionally, we're proposing to update the IGA to remove reimbursement to MCDD for overhead, which was previously included in the reimbursement. As the budget committee, you're charged with making the final decision on the budget to be adopted. Staff are recommending that you keep the budget as proposed, although it doesn't fully cover the costs of staff working on district business. It's reflective of the funding that the district has available. We've included two other options that could be considered in relation to the budget, but both have their challenges as well. The budget is a reminder to us that we're working with a temporary funding mechanism that's unsustainable. Additionally, the revenue of the legacy district fund the review of the legacy district fund balances reminds us that we're operating with a limited time period and the need to provide the support our board needs to move forward with revenue decisions for the urban district. So coming up in the budget process on April 5th, we'll be taking public comment on the proposed budget. On the 20th, we'll request the board to approve the budget in anticipation of our TSCC budget hearing on June 7th. At that hearing, board members will be responding to questions from the TSCC commissioners about the budget. And of course, we'll give you some support on that so that you know what questions are coming and can have the information that you need to be able to give them the answers. And on June 15th, we're scheduled to convene the board for adoption of the budget. Just as a reminder, we have to adopt the budget before June 30th, or we are under Oregon local budget law not able to pay any expenditures starting July 1st. So we will be asking for your adoption on June 15th. And now we're to the end, so I'm going to stop sharing and I can take any questions, or Jim can take any questions at this point if you have any.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Jim. Any questions? Corky. Corky, you're on mute.
Well, that was probably better with me muted, but Laura, you mentioned at the end there that I think, if I understood you correctly, not all the staffing costs are included in this budget.
That's correct.
Which, if I'm making the right assumption, is something that I think we're probably all kind of prone to. Is like, well, we'll just, we'll put some staff over there, and not charge for it. But I'm a little bit concerned with what that might lead us to down the road. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about being a little more consistent or a little more conscious about saying, here's how much cost MCDD staff has incurred, and then having MCD hopefully, cover that, grant that, but just being clear rather than kind of hiding it in the shuffle.
If I understand your question correctly, yes. If the staff continue to put in the same level of effort next year in working on the transition to the urban district as we've put in this year, we're short in the budget by about $400,000. A portion of that is overhead. So that's things like it takes staff support to support the staff that's working on the district. So things like payroll and accounts payable and HR and all of those things that kind of are here to support the entire organization. So those costs out of our estimates altogether. But additionally, we're just not reflecting all of the hours that are likely to need to be incurred. And what that really means is MCDD pays for the staff. In the MCDD budget, we're not increasing the FTEs, we're keeping them constant. But if the staff are not charging all of the time that they're working on the urban district, then that additional cost where staff isn't really working on MCDD is going to remain in MCDD, and MCDD will need to cover that. So the way that shows up is that there's a reduced amount of resources for MCDD.
Right. And so my suggestion is, let's be honest about it. Let's note how much time MCD and how much cost MCD is incurring. And I would hope that when we go to MCD, they'll say, that's fine, we'll continue covering that cost, but just kind of, not showing that gives me pause. That bothers me, that might lead to some problems in the future.
I agree. And we will definitely be reviewing those sources of revenue on the MCDD side, because as you saw, the fund balance is a bit challenged for MCDD, especially when you get to the end of this upcoming fiscal year. And in addition, our revenues are a bit challenged because of the new compression losses that we're experiencing as well. So we will definitely be reviewing all of that. And we also sent this budget out to all of our legacy districts and invited those board members to join us today so that they could see the issues that we're discussing with relation to this budget as well. But I will be sure to be very clear in my communication about what's happening. I missed that last part.
To be clear, I'm not suggesting that we don't cover those costs, just that they're appropriately noted as to who's paying them.
Yes, thank you.
Eric?
So follow on to Corky, I agree with you completely on that. And in particular, I think that it's now time for us to really start to get into the details of the work that's being done by the staff on behalf of the urban district. And, we've made a stab at that previously in showing where people have been charging their time, but I think that we need to be a little bit more proactive. And it may come down to actually being the urban that says, okay, let's approve spending on these projects and then turn that over to MCDD and just sort of say, this is the number of hours that it's worth to us to have this completed. So there are some things there that from an internal controls perspective would make sense to have that review really and approval done by the urban, and I'm pleased that you're taking that direction. Now for the substantive question I have, I want to turn our attention back to the MCDD staff support because I am getting a little bit lost in terms of the number of positions that are in the direct allocation for FY 22-23 versus FY 23-24. So in that first line of $290,000, first of all, what was the budget for the direct allocation in 22-23?
$450,000.
Okay. And then that covered How many
That
positions?
covered another position and a half. So, and that's, you know, salaries and benefits.
Okay. So that was 1.5 positions more. And then how many positions are in the direct allocation today?
I do not have the list of positions in front of me. I apologize. I can definitely pull that IGA. I know it contains a portion of Jim, 20%. It contains a portion of me at 20%. But I don't recall who else is included in that. And I would have to pull the IGA. So my apologies. I'll do that and get that information out.
I think that it covers our transition manager, correct?
A portion of her, even in continuing in this new budget, it's 50% of our transition manager. And we have realigned her responsibilities. So that is reflective of her level of focus on the urban district for next year.
Okay, so 450 down to 290. And
also a portion of that, Eric, is because we're not charging the overhead. So the 450 included the overhead charge on the direct charge positions as well.
And we also have a couple of staff who are doing urban work who are paid for by JCI. So keep that in mind.
So that really comes down to another issue that in our budget, now that Congress has approved it, we're authorized to go. At some point, much of the planning staff will go on to capital projects because the engineering expense and the management of that is a capitalizable expense. Do you have anything in the current budget that capitalizes that part of the personnel expense?
It doesn't take away the expenditure under governmental accounting.
I understand that it's a cash expense, but
we are
do need to
identifying those things that fall under the generally accepted accounting policies for capitalization.
Excellent. So I understand that it is a cash expense and there's no argument there, but what I wanted to do was make certain that I understood which of this would ultimately be paid back into the system and when we do our bond issue.
I think I can't answer that question at this point because the answer is it depends. You can get sort of pre-award authorization to go back and reimburse yourself for spending that has occurred prior to the issuance of the bond. But we need to work with bond counsel on that to determine what will be the appropriate request. So that could be anywhere from 0 to the full amount of time that people are putting in, but until we finalize that information and work with bond counsel to get their authorization on it, I don't have an answer for that. But
from a finance perspective, I think that it's important for us to look at this as a capitalizable expense and therefore something that does need to be included in the bond issue, because like any big project, you're going to have engineering costs and those things need to be included. So I think that we need to be forthright in our discussions with bond counsel about why the engineering and management costs should be included.
Yes, and we're already having those discussions.
So to do yet to come from your office is, you know, how many FTEs and what's that breakdown for FY 22, 23, and then 23, 24.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
One additional variable to think about, Mr. Molander, is that some of those could be in-kind contributions, and I'm not sure how they would be treated under a bond if we're getting credit for local match. So it's another thing we need to be mindful of and think through, but you're raising excellent points. Thank you.
Dr. Reeser.
Yeah, just to follow up on something Eric mentioned, as we're kind of looking at whether or not the engineering and planning costs are either operating or capital, I think we've talked about them in both the operating expenditure presentation. Not sure where they're included in the capital bond, but I'd like, when we talk about the capital bond, I'd like a little bit of clarity of, is this an operating expense or is it a bond expense? And if That way we can put it into one bucket and not include it in both the operating expenditure and the capital.
Well, I think at this point, because we don't have the bond, it is an expenditure for this urban district. So even when you're able to capitalize something, yes, we could get a reimbursement for that on the GEO bond, but again, that will be dependent upon our discussions with bond counsel. So at this point, because we don't have a GEO bond, these are all operating expenses for the urban district.
So is the GEO bond presentation going to include any existing staffing that's going to be capitalized as part of that bond, or is the assumption that none of that's getting capitalized in the GEO bond presentation and all of that's going to be an operating expenditure as presented in this budget?
It would continue to be an operating expenditure in this budget. It will be considered for reimbursement on a GEO bond should the GEO bond move forward. But that doesn't impact this budget. And I think as we stand with the estimates that Bill will be presenting related to the GEO bond, there are percentages that have been added in to cover project management, engineering, and even a percentage that's been added in for overhead. But it is because this is early in the process, it's a percentage. And so we haven't said, okay, Lori's time that she spent on the urban district creating this budget is going to end up rolling into the GEO bond, which is an extreme example because that wouldn't be capital cost. We haven't gone to that level of detail at this point. So he's at this point using percentages to be able to calculate an estimate of what those costs will be.
Just want to duly note the need to not double count, right? So we are going to do our very best to put all qualified expenditures into the bond for your consideration. That bond is starting with fairly chunky pixels right now today, and it's going to get more and more refined when we get to the place where we have an approved budget that authorizes specific appropriations for projects. And that's the point where we're going to have a really clear delineation of what's bond eligible and what's operating. But we are making assumptions in the initial presentation of scenarios that incorporate staffing that would be covered by the bond, if that helps. And we can tell you a little bit more about where those calculations are today and how we intend with your direction to get them tighter and tighter to the place where you feel like you've got the detail you need.
Now, governmental accounting makes this kind of a weird proposition because you do really kind of look like you end up double counting, because if we get reimbursement back from the bond, it'll be a resource. It won't be a negative expense. So it does get a little funky when you look at the accounting, but right now we need to have appropriation authority to be able to cover our costs, and the bond is not a resource at this point. So right now we are including everything in this budget.
Understood. And Jim, thanks for clarifying that. I think my biggest concern is we're either going to be getting money from debt service on a GEO bond or from operating expenditures. And I just want to make sure that we're, at some point, we clarify which is going to be which.
Yes, and I'm doing that as I work through the next round of forecast, which is what I do in my second shift, as Jim well knows now.
And then the other question is, you guys have kind of presented so with this budget, we're running out of money at the end of 2024.
That's correct. And then we have more loan to draw down on in that upcoming year. But clearly, as you can see, as we reduce the amount of carry forward each year, it makes this budget tighter and tighter.
So is there so can you tell me a little bit about kind of what the plan is? Obviously, raising revenues or getting a different revenue source is great, but typically when you're facing that kind of dire financial forecast, you have a presentation of both revenue raising options and cost containment measures. And I'm wondering if there are any cost containment measures in this current budget, or kind of what the discussion's been.
The cost containment is the fact that we're not charging 100% of the staff to this budget that we anticipate will be working on this entity. When we get to MCDD, mean, we are not making reductions in staff for the upcoming year, but it is certainly something that we'll need to consider for 24-25 because there won't be enough funding to cover the staffing that we've got.
So I understand kind of the moving of money between MCDD and urban flood safety, but ultimately the new district is going to take on all the liabilities of the legacy districts. So just saying that it's going to be covered by MCDD doesn't necessarily mean that the problem that we're facing between the legacy districts and urban flood safety has gone down at all. We're shifting the cost from flood safety to MCDD, but if the overall cost, when I talk about cost containment, it's not moving money from one bucket, one organization to another.
But it is because these are separate organizations currently. So it is.
I think the pitch you're hearing from your staff today, and it's subject obviously to approval and direction from the board, is don't make those cuts now, but get moving on the new revenue model and expand the collection to the new district. Be in touch with our Levy Ready Columbia partners and so on, so that we have adequate capacity to complete the task and get to a stable operating revenue source. It's also why we're emphasizing the need to get back to you all with updated operating forecast and an agreement on how we can proceed to collect that. So that's what we're recommending now. It's also why we've held expenditures flat this year, why we're not proposing any new FTE. So those are the steps we've taken so far. If the board directs us to take a cut package, we will do that, but we're not recommending it currently.
Thank you.
Danny, and then Nancy.
Hi there.
And Danny.
I guess my first question would be, what is our plan for operational cash for 24-25?
It's in the works. I think that if we have not moved forward with our new revenue decision and we're continuing to operate in this manner, we'll be having tougher discussions, particularly about the MCDD budget in 24-25. We will need to work with our borrowing options to get some interim funding that will carry us through until we collect on our assessments, and we will likely have to do some staffing reductions to balance MCDD in the following year.
Okay. And as we transition eventually to the new district, how are we going to do that first year of funding there?
That's what we're working on right now, is what are we going to propose to you as board members to consider for that first year of funding?
Okay. And initially we looked at, there was like 7 unfilled FTEs. Right, we saw that one a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And
on MCDD, yes.
Yeah, are those positions in this forecast remaining unfilled?
Those positions and their cost are still included in the MCDD forecast. So those are positions that we need that just happen to be unfilled at this time.
Okay, so they're included in the new forecast, but really,
yes,
we're going to be asking MCDD to eat a lot of that cost.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, and we're actually doing this right now over here in BES, is keeping some positions vacant longer just to get some savings. And I assume, I mean, it's a fairly typical move, and I assume that's part of your calculus. But yeah,
yes.
What I'm taking, thanks. What I'm definitely taking away is we do have big work to do on the revenue pieces that we've been working on for a while, but we definitely need to land sometime very soon, so we don't keep continuing to lose money every year, and that things are set up to go with a new revenue stream in FY25.
Correct.
Yep. Okay. So with this current shortfall, I see on slide 11, I think, you have options presented to us, and I know that we're just discussing things today, but so one option sounds like MCDD eats it. Thanks, MCDD.
That's kind of where we're at, yeah.
Yeah, right. That's where it is right now. It's the default
Mhm.
option. Another option is to reduce some of the consultant dollars, but increase staff dollars and get less done. So
Correct.
it's basically a little bit, you get less done for not quite as much money. So
You get different things done.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And
But
then
if you look at the comms budget and you look at what we're missing in staff budget, you can't totally, even if you eliminated the comms budget, you're not going to have enough to cover the staff costs.
right. And then the other one, the other option is identifying new resources, which I think you're working on working with several of us on that.
Yes.
Okay, so we have some options here on the table. You're certainly looking for more suggestions if we have them.
Yes.
Newsflash, I don't.
I was hoping you did.
Yeah. But I guess thanks for the wake-up call on that. I do think, along with, I have been involved with the districts for a long time, and many of you have too. And so wanting these districts to stay functional for the next 100 years is super important. So I will be making sure we're all aiming for that North Star. I think this is very important. So
thank you.
Tanny, just in light of your comment about vacant FTE, conversation probably less than 2 hours ago about a vacant position where the appropriate staff director and I were discussing whether that position could remain vacant. So just again, really looking deep at every opportunity we have to reduce costs and still get the critical work done. So it's a daily conversation, and we appreciate the board's direction if there is specific direction you can offer.
And I guess there is one specific direction I would like to offer. I'm curious what the other board members think about this, but I definitely think the staff we have are, well, put it this way, I would like to avoid layoffs. Like, I'd rather keep positions vacant than go to layoffs. So I think, I'm pretty sure it's like in everyone's mind, but I just think I'd like to state the obvious.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Any other questions, comments for Lori and Jim on this item?
If I may, Mr. Chair, I know some of you dig deeper into these things, and we know this is a large group and it may not always be simple for you to ask questions. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out. And for the rest of you, when we get questions from board members, we will do our best to tally them and capture them and share the information that we're providing to individuals with all of you, so that you all have the benefit of the wisdom of the questions that are being asked in our effort to answer them. So feel free to reach out independent of the board meetings. Just try not to email all of you at the same time. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're a little bit behind schedule, but very important discussion. Let's transition now. Colin, are you ready to talk about the revenue update?
I am. Thanks all. Colin Rowan, Director of Planning Public Affairs, going to give a brief update on the revenue collection issues that we've been discussing, and hopefully be able to get y'all back on schedule. So we continue to look at what our revenue options are based on the available legislation and the conversations that we've been having, and also looking at what additional options are available. And that's what was presented at the last meeting. A set of options that would either require going back to Salem to make adjustments, or potentially seeking other options to fund this organization. And so presenting those challenges, the board requested a review of the due diligence process that we went through that led us to the conclusion that what's in the existing legislation was largely unworkable. And so staff began assembling that information. And while we feel pretty confident that we've done a good job presenting the board with information around cost considerations, especially for direct billing. We also recognize that the board hasn't had enough information and conversation around challenges regarding nexus and proportionality, especially as it relates to putting this operating revenue on the existing utility bills of the municipalities. And so having that conversation, we identified that this is really a good conversation to have Hong as the district counsel, as well as Jeff Condit as outside counsel come in and have that executive session that's on Monday. And so be able to dig deeper into that information, but also after that presentation, we'll be able to provide a memo to the board that goes over what those challenges are, what we have done with the board to address those things, and categorizing them in three ways: either technical challenges or opportunities, legal challenges, opportunities, and political challenges and opportunities. So after that executive session that's upcoming, we'll be able to have a further conversation, as well as being able to fill out more information on what path to take forward. As Jim noted, time is of the essence of this, and also your last agenda item on funding and sort of staring down a FY 24-25 precipice. We are continuing to have conversations, especially with municipal government representatives, around what options are available. There's really no path forward with any of the fixes or any of the changes without having really good agreement about how to move forward, especially amongst those municipal partners. And so we're still having those conversations. We will bring those conversations back to this board to have discussion and get direction once we know what is sort of in the realm of possibility. And we'll also be able to provide you with the detail on our due diligence and what we see as a path forward. So there's more work to be done, more conversation to be had after Monday, but I wanted to give you an update on where we've been in the last couple of weeks since our last meeting. So yeah, please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Colin. Any questions? Not seeing any, and this leaves us with the remainder of the time to talk about the GeoBond scenarios. Jamie, are you ready to go?
Yep, all ready. Carrie's going to share this. Carrie's going to share the slides, and the presentation will be primarily Bill and myself. And we have a number of slides to walk through, and we'll ask that you hold your questions until the end, because I think that some of the slides that we'll present may answer some of the questions that you have. So, so first, hello, welcome to everybody. I'm glad to be here at your meeting again. And I just wanted to say, as I listened to the your budget conversation and your operating revenue discussion and engaging with all your staff, it's just remarkable the work that you're all doing to stand up this organization. I mean, this is the hardest part of implementing the legislation and the vision that everybody has. And it's just, it's a lot that you're all managing, and I just am always amazed at your staff and your ability. So kudos. So a couple slides here just to start things off. So we've come to you now over the last couple of months in increments about the GeoBond conversation. One of the first things we brought to you is, what is the GeoBond and what is your role in that? We talked with you at a previous board meeting about how we talk about the GeoBond with each other and with our publics. At one of the last meetings, we shared with you about what goes into developing the packages. So you had a sense of what the methodology is that goes into developing a GeoBond package. And today we're here to bring to you this second part of the GeoBond package conversation, which is the different scenarios. And we introduced to you at the last meeting the range of scenarios and what that's starting to look like. And a big thanks to Chair Fancher for sending out an email giving people a little bit of a heads up, about what you're going to see in the presentation today. So I just want to let you know that this is the part 2 of probably 8-part conversation. We're definitely going to be coming back to you through your board meetings in April with more detail and more information about these different scenarios. So with that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. As always, I try to remind people where we are in the schedule. This is something that's familiar to all of you. The red arrow is where we are. Here we are in the spring. We're still working with all of you to figure out, what are the scenarios that you want to bring out to the public, and making sure that you're comfortable and understand what those scenarios are. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And again, these first few slides are a little bit of a reminder. So remember back in, I think it was January, we did the presentation about what the key steps are in the GeoBond development. We talked in January, February about putting in place the engagement education work group to help augment your leadership. And then we have electoral landscape analysis that's currently underway. We're going to be bringing that to you in your April board meeting. And here we are focused on the draft bond scenarios today. So let's just go ahead and go to the next slide. And thanks, Carrie, for doing this. So again, a reminder, why are we doing this GeoBond? To provide investments to upgrade and improve the flood safety system, design flood safety improvements, integrating environment, equity, cultural history elements to the extent we can, and obtain required revenue for capital investments that supplement your annual fees. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And I also shared this with you at the last meeting when we talked about methodology of putting together these packages. Some of the primary inputs, and Chair Fancher referenced this in the email he sent, are existing engineering reports. I mean, your staff, you've been doing a tremendous amount of work over the last few years, looking at where you have vulnerabilities, what are your options for addressing those, what are your assets and liabilities, what's your capital program look like. All of this information has gone into helping to create the bond scenarios that we're sharing with you today. In addition, your mission, vision, values, which you have some new new aspects to your vision that are a little larger than the current legacy districts. And then we also, as with any good project management, you've got to factor in contingency and escalation. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of the outcomes, and again, I shared this one with you last. I think this is the last of the reminder slides, and so all the next slides should be new. So what are the bond outcomes? What are we hoping to achieve? There's the objectives, and then there's the, okay, what are these investments designed to address? And it's primarily, it's the PMLS, Portland Metro Levy System local share funding, the levy system upgrades to modern standards, comprehensive flood safety system for localized flooding, improving emergency response preparedness and system resiliency, and advancing the ORS 550 mission, vision, values of environment, equity, cultural history within the context of flood management, flood risk management, and guided by bond counsel and financial accounting rules to ensure bond eligible projects. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So what we know. So we know our system is at risk. We know that our resiliency to flood events is low. We know that redundancy in pumping capacity and power supply is minimal, or the system's been tested by recent flooding events. It has performed, but it has been, at the peak. We will experience a significant event. We've been lucky. You've heard Bill say, there, but by the grace of God, go us. When you look at California, that atmospheric river could just very easily be over us, and we would be in a very different situation. Our federal government considers us an important and good investment. The collaborative work that led to the creation of this new district, as well as all of the partners, as well as all of the work that's gone in to date, has led to some initial funding being released that Mark Wilcox will be talking with Format about next week. So some of that federal dollars are already coming in. And so they, the government thinks that we're a good investment. And we have a responsibility to provide flood safety to our communities. That's our primary job. And so this bond measure helps us to do that. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And then I'm going to hand it over to Bill. And Bill is going to take the lead on walking you through the different scenarios and giving you some examples of projects that are in each one. So Bill, you ready?
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Good afternoon, all. I'm Bill Owen. I'm the Director of Engineering and Operations and Chief Engineer at the district. As Jamie said, I'm going to walk through some slides here and explain to you a little more detail than what of these bond scenarios than you saw in the email that Chair Pancher sent out, as well as our previous presentations. So, as an engineer, I want to understand what risk we face, and thankfully, the district has reports and studies that we can point to as our basis to identify what areas are higher risk and what areas are lower risk when it comes to flood safety. So I referenced a couple of reports on this slide to that. But in addition to that, we are applying asset management principles to identify other cost-effective investments. And that information was woven into the assets and liabilities report. So those are the primary pieces where I look to when trying to understand risk and apply it to these bond scenarios. So next slide, please. So this slide is just a reminder that the GEO bond really is at this point, our only feasible path to fund major capital investments. These type of investments are well beyond $1 million and are well beyond the budget and borrowing capacity of the current district, certainly, and it supplements the annual fee that we were envisioning for the new urban district that pays for operating costs as well as small capital improvements. But anything larger would need a different funding source like this. And collectively, we recognize these proposed improvements work together for one system and should be addressed in a holistic manner. So next slide, please. So let me start getting into a little more of the details of the bond scenarios. I'm going to talk about some common elements first, and then get into each one of the scenarios. So let me start off with some of the cost, sort of the basis of the cost estimates for these bond scenarios. We certainly have contingency in the project estimates, depending on what level of project design those projects have been developed. We have incorporated some estimate of what inflation will do over time. That's, of course, that's a broad number or a broad concept that deals with labor and materials and equipment and all sorts of things. So we've attempted to incorporate that. We have also incorporated costs for project management and engineering staff for each of the projects. It's assuming that the projects are going to extend for approximately 3 years, and so thus we include these staff costs accordingly. And in addition to the cost estimates, also include some anticipated design elements, integrate the 550 purposes, including the new ones, including environment, equity, and cultural history as part of the flood safety capital project. So next slide, please. Right, so would address on that last point. What am I thinking when we're talking about multi-objective designs to incorporate these new RS 550 purposes? Well, on the environmental side, examples could be what type of material selection do you use when you're doing a pump station design that could also lead to a smaller carbon footprint. There are things that are like LEED accreditation that incorporate many different aspects that help improve your environmental footprint as part of the design. Native vegetation, green stormwater facilities, even things like going after Energy Trust of Oregon credits that we currently do and would continue doing. as part of future flood safety projects. On the cultural history side, there are opportunities such as signage that are possible. I think about the ports sign, interpretive sign out along or next to the Sandy River levee near the Troutdale Airport, where they reference work that and activities of Native peoples out in that area. So that's an example of a sign that they've installed out there not too long ago. I've also included sculptures into some of the Green Street facilities I've designed in the past down in Southeast Portland that connect back to former logging industry, back at the turn of the century, turn of the 19th century, I guess it is. Finally, I want to make sure to emphasize that the equity purpose of RS 550 would also be incorporated here. In particular, we're looking at embedding that in all of our procurement processes, whether that's involving RFP selection criteria, requirements for contractors that we select to use, whether the state of Oregon certified firms or other aspects that either staff or others can suggest how we can incorporate as part of that procurement work. Next slide, please. In all the bond scenarios that I'm going to be describing here today, they include these 6 components. It's been clear that this board wants to make sure that we have funds available for the Portland Metro levy study system, cost share with the federal government. So that's included. We want to make sure that the levies can be accredited. So there's a series of FEMA projects that are included in all scenarios. The multi-objective design components I was just talking about in the previous slide. There are nature-based flood safety projects, primarily that are going to be guided by the future watershed plan. But there are ideas that we've already talked about in your meetings, such as creating wetlands for flood storage purposes. I think about the Ports Trip wetland that's out in Fairview and Troutdale that I know some of you have seen. Also including things like changing the material on the levee slope next to slow moving water. So it doesn't necessarily have to be riprap per se, but it could be some geotextiles or some other types of environmentally more sensitive material. There also, in all the scenarios, we're suggesting that we include a more safe and functional facility for our operations team. For those of you who've been on our campus, the building that's there is basically a glorified shed. It doesn't really have the right HVAC or ventilation system for long-term use, working in the bays and so forth. So that's proposed as well as here. Finally, I want to make sure to emphasize that that there would be a citizen oversight committee that would be part of the details of which still to be determined. But our intent is that that type of committee exists that would include stakeholders who would track bond-funded projects and work with staff on decisions that affected bond investments. So next slide, please. So let me talk about the first of 3 sets of scenarios. First represents sort of our baseline flood safety work. Those include both a $150 million scenario as well as $175. The $150 million scenario covers the topics I just walked through, but also includes some pump station work that deals with capacity, that addresses some of the highest risk for potential flooding events within the internal system. Those are areas that include locations near the airports, Broadmoor Pump Station, and the PIR pump station out in Pen 1 near the old Vanport site. The latter of which we've submitted application for federal funding. So we're hopeful that this money would help pay for a local share for a federal grants for construction purposes. So, and finally, the 150 also deals with pump station power contingency. We have really no backup system for power at our pump stations. And so installing transfer switches that allow a generator to be plugged in quickly has been standard practice for many decades, and we just need to get caught up with that. Alternatively, we may also need to just build a secondary generation system there just for very short periods of time, like a 24-hour period, when some power backup systems may not be available. So that's $150 million level. 175 includes those items, but it also includes additional pump station capacity needs at other sites that are not at the highest level of risk, but very close to. That deals with a pump station in Pen 2, pretty close to I-5, Schmier Road pump station, as well as one out by 181st in Portland. So this $175 million scenario is staff's recommended baseline because it deals with the larger needs for the internal drainage to address risk for internal drainage. But certainly it doesn't really address other risks that the district has dealing that would benefit system efficiency and longevity, and that's what I'll be talking about here next. So next slide. So when we think about how we would more comprehensively reduce community flood risk, the $200 million scenario is one that we've created. The first piece it does, it replaces 4 out of the 6 pumps at our biggest pump stations that affect East Multnomah County in particular, and parts of PDX. That's pump stations 1 and 4 for those who have been inside those pump stations. These pumps wouldn't increase, the new pumps wouldn't necessarily increase capacity, but they'd be replacing them. They were installed in the late 90s. Typical design life or service life for pumps of those nature are 20 years. So our staff is able to keep them running, but by the time this bond could be funded and work can be done, we're getting in very much into the gray area of whether those still can be effective. So we've included pump replacements in here. Part of the pump replacements could also be include some design aspects that could extend their service life and reduce energy efficiency. Variable speed drives are elements that can be added to it. So the pump doesn't necessarily have to be on or off, but it could be run at a point in between, and thus saving electricity and the wear and tear on the pump. So in addition to those pump station improvements, there are improvements to the levee tow drains. These drains will be at about 100 years old by the time this bond measure will be coming. We will be able to have funds available from this bond measure. So this particular scenario begins to address the replacement of some of these very old tow drains. These are drainage pipes that are underneath the levees, and there are some near the Portland and Troutdale airports that would have to be considered for replacement, along with some other sites. What's not listed on here, but it is included in the $20 million number, also is the ability to improve the resiliency of some of the levee surfaces, where there's very scant or little vegetation. That really is our primary protection to make sure that the original material of the levee, it's mainly sand, doesn't move during large rain events. So we need an improved cap, if you will, of the levee surface, so that sand doesn't move during large rain events. So next slide, please. Yeah, and the last set of bond scenarios deals more with more of a longer term outlook for flood safety. This is includes both a $225 and $250 million scenario. It replaces all 6 of those pumps that I was referring to earlier at pump stations 1 and 4. It also recognizes that several other assets will come to the point of the end of their service life. Some of them include the concrete flood walls, emergency closures in Pen 1 and Pen 2. So most of our levee systems, as you know, are earthen embankments, but there are sections of it that are concrete walls, and those walls are going to be 100 years old. So that is something we're looking out to. It doesn't need to replace right now, but in the very near future, we need to examine that. And it includes other aspects, including tow drains that not only are just for selected parts, but really all areas within the managed floodplain where we could address those that aging infrastructure. So and finally, these scenarios allow us to be more proactive about integrating investments in natural flood protection solutions. We're thinking primarily at this point of additional wetlands for flood safety or flood storage purposes. Of course, that involves real estate investments as well as the actual design construction. So those end up, particularly on the real estate side, as many of you know, that's you start talking about some larger numbers. And I believe that's the end. So next slide, please. Yep. And so at this point, I'm going to shift it back over to Jamie to finish off the last couple of slides. And I hope to be able to answer your questions at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bill. And apologies, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I've gotten so familiar with all of you. Jamie Damon with Kearns & West. I'm leading your strategic communications and engagement team. So got a couple more slides, and then we want to reserve the balance of the time for questions, conversation with all of you. So this is a slide I presented at the last meeting, and it really is this big question of, at what cost? So part of what we're trying to do is find that sweet spot between what Bill has shared about what the known needs are and what the public is willing to support. And so we're considering the merits and limitations of each of these different scenarios to shape realistic options for the public. Your job as a board is to help us identify what that range is. What is the range that you're comfortable with? What is the range that you would like some more information from your public about to know where folks are willing to invest with you in your system? So let me just go to the next slide. And this is one that we presented last time. It's a reminder. And so just when you're thinking about the range of scenarios, these are big numbers. And you saw in what Bill presented, there was kind of a range at the low end of 150 to 175. Staff is recommending that 175 is your baseline for all the reasons that Bill stated. And hopefully you've got some good questions for him about how he arrived at that. And then there's a middle ground of 200 million, and then an upper end. And again, you saw a range of 225 to 250 million. It's worth it to remember. So this is what the polling said that they would support. An average assessed home value within the district is about 350,000. This is assessed value, about 350,000. And that comes out to be about $3.50 to $6 a month is the range if you look at this. And when you start to build in like 150 to 175, 200, 225, it's really 2 cent increments that you're looking at in terms of the cost per thousand. And the overall, the majority of the support, certainly it starts to wane, as you get to those bigger numbers. But even the biggest number that we pulled in terms of combined with what we anticipate operating revenues to be, folks are still supportive in that $60 to $84 a year range. And so it's important to keep in mind, one of the things that we talked about with your engineering team and your leadership team as we're thinking about putting these packages together and recognizing that all of you are very keenly aware of, your constituents and communities and what and the burdens of additional costs are to those communities, that one of the benefits of polling and going out for community engagement is to get a sense of what the community wants to invest in and what the community would support. And if the community comes in and says, hey, these are important and we want to invest at a higher end with you, that's something to consider to accept the public, the community's support. Let me go to the next slide. I think this is our last one. I want to give you a sense of what's happening next. So as I said, this is part 2 of the bond scenario conversation. We're going to come back to you in your board meetings, both board meetings in April, with more information. Carrie is working together with all of us on some fact sheets that give you more detail about what each one of these bond packages includes, with more examples, so that you can have that as a takeaway. We also recognize that we've done this before with you on other topics that are complicated, like drink of water real quick. And I'm happy to do one-on-one meetings to, sit down with the spreadsheets that that Bill and his team has created. I mean, they've done a tremendous amount of work over the last few months to get to these numbers, and for Bill to share with you what he shared with you today. So more conversation in April. And then the other piece to be thinking about, and this is something we would like all of you to be thinking about, are, what are the key questions that for the stakeholders to help the board refine the package. So this goes back to what I said at that previous slide, which is, we take out the scenarios that you're all comfortable with, and we ask the public, what do they think? And what are the priorities for investment? Should we be looking at targeted investments, system-wide investments? Should we be focusing on just the highest risk and not looking at the modernization costs or longevity of the system? These are questions that it'd be helpful to understand from the public's perspective what they would like to invest in as well. And also, their ideas and approaches for environment, equity, and cultural history investments, to the extent we can build those in to bond projects. So Steve, I think this is my last slide. If you want to jump in and kick off the questions.
Sure, that sounds good. Do you want to stop sharing so we can see everybody?
Sure, yeah.
And I told you guys I wouldn't put myself in first just because I'm the chair, so I made sure to get my hand up. And I'm gonna call on myself because I don't see any of the hands up right now. Bill and Jamie, that was excellent information. I think that was a really, really good start. I feel like I would like to see the actual projects and like how they tally up to 150 million, and the projects and how they tally up to the 200 million. Maybe you're not quite there with the level of detail yet, but I think that would be, for me, that's really important to see. I mean, I know this isn't the case, but like the shop, for example, within the 150 million, like I don't know that, it's not 140 million out of the 150 million. You haven't shown me that. I just need to see how kind of you've done a really good job of categorizing projects, and that's great, but I want to see the projects within those categories and how they add up to 150 million, how they add up to the rest. I just went through Planning Commission and Finance Committee this week on our CIP, for example, and I stepped them through 100 projects. It was painful, yeah, but they can't claim that I didn't give them all the information, that they didn't have enough details for each project, what each project accomplished. I also kind of want to see where in this, I assume it's a 30-year horizon we're talking about. Maybe that's a question for you, is what's the time horizon that the bond is is paid for by customers in the time frame that we have to deliver these projects. And for each of the projects where you've listed the cost, I want to see where in that horizon we think it is. Maybe there's some pump projects where we don't need to replace that pump for 20 years. Well, if that's the case, I'd like to see it. So maybe it's just a almost like an Excel spreadsheet or a matrix that shows the projects, it shows costs, and it shows a little dot over the 30-year horizon about when we think we would start or finish this project. To me, if I had that for each of these packages, I'd be set. Like I would know exactly what I'm getting for my money. And I'm really supportive, I think, generally of even higher amounts here than the 150s, because I feel like with the capital bond, the voters are voting on it, so they know what they're getting into. I also feel like these are really, really high value projects, all of them, as you've described them. I don't see any fluff here. I don't see anything that's like, oh, that'd be nice to have. These are all important things. We just need to have that level of detail to know exactly what we're getting. And I see Emerald's hand up first, and then Seth, and then Corky, and then Nancy.
And actually, Steve, before Emerald speaks, I just want to say for everybody, what Steve just laid out in terms of the kinds of information that you'd like more of is exactly what we're hoping you'll tell us today, because we want to pull together those fact sheets and then have the next conversation with you at your next board meeting. So thank you. Thanks, Steve, for that.
Okay, Emerald.
I agree that looking at, you know, what this pays for, I don't need the super deep dive. I just need the, you know, sort of a high level and a bit of the narrative around it. And then kind of a basic question, when do we need to decide? You might have covered this and I missed it, but when does this decision need to be made? And I was struck by the slide that shows what the support does at certain thresholds of funding. A 15-point swing is really meaningful, right? And so I would want to take a look at that and think about, and I know that, you know, another $50 million is equally meaningful. So I get that it's a really tricky balancing exercise, and I would be really interested in what FM3 would have to say about the cost and risk benefit there. And potentially interested in additional research. That's a high stakes question. So maybe with my basic one, when do we need to decide?
So our current goal, Emerald, is, again, subject to board discussion and approval, would be to refer something in time for the May 24 ballot. We are working with our political consultants and pollsters to examine both the May electorate and the November electorate to see if there are different impacts on the potential support for our measure. If you start working backwards from a filing deadline, the more time you have to do education, the better. But we also need to take the time to get the package right. So we think late summer, early fall probably being, you know, starting to get a little tight on the time frame. And we are working with the political consultants now to tee up the next round of polling. We think that we should get a little bit more refinement before we invest. We have enough resources set aside for one more round of research. So we'd like to get a little farther along to be able to test a little bit more clearly what the options the board is considering. So I hope that answered your question.
It does, and FM3 always does a great job of testing potential oppositional messages and testing the sensitivity of those messages. So I'm hopeful about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
If I could maybe supplement on the timeline, that timeline that Jim's talking to, that's when we'll be using this first round of information to start bringing it down to a single referral package from the range. And then we'll be working with you and thinking about a referral vote in the late fall, early winter. So more of a November, December timeline before there's a vote.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand the timeline for referral. I'm interested in when does this board really need to align on the size of the package? And that's a ways ahead of referral.
Yeah, late summer, early fall, ideally.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, just to piggyback a little on Steve's, when there's a list that comes out, I'm especially interested in the 150 million. How much of that is required by the Army Corps, how much of it is required to meet FEMA, and how much of it is neither of those?
Tell you a little bit now, Bill, I'm going to defer to you on the FEMA projects, but we need to provide 1/3 match to the Corps. And I think the current forecast for the Corps projects is about 110 million. So 1/3 of that for the PMLS match. And Bill saved me from myself on the FEMA projects.
Yeah, I think we can provide that level of detail to you, Seth, and Steve and others here. So that I will make sure to break those out.
And then my follow-up question to that is, kind of, if there's a other category in that 150 million, maybe put a priority of kind of what made the case for the non-FEMA, non-PMLS required that made it into the 150 million versus what's an ad package, and kind of why that happened, kind of.
Okay, I think I'm tracking you. So if I understood you right, Seth, you're thinking the PMLS and the FEMA are sort of the core or baseline, and everything else is considered an ad package beyond that. Is that the right interpretation?
I'm just wondering if there's something that's in the 150 million that's not required by FEMA or PMLS.
Yeah, and there definitely is. And I'll make sure to note that, and apologize if I wasn't clear enough during that slide. But yeah, there's those two sets of projects, then the pump station projects I was talking about, as well as the contents of the one slide that was in all projects or all scenarios. Excuse me. So I'll make sure to make sure that's clear when I send that out.
Thanks, Bill.
Yep.
Corky.
A few questions for clarification. One is, if I got this right, an average homeowner is going to be paying $50 to $100 per year for that 150 million to 250 million range. Is that right?
About 40 to 60, 40 okay. to 70. Yeah.
All right. Another one is, does that include the cost of collections and the cost of non-payments?
The capital bond collections will go on the property tax bill, so there's not an additional cost for that. And collection rates run, Lori, you may know, but they're in the 96 to 98% range, if I'm not
95%.
95, yeah.
All right. And then on the, on Bill's stuff, I noticed in the last one, and I might have missed this a little bit because I had to take away, by the way, I just got a call. Mary Helen's husband said that she's out of surgery, but is way too groggy to say how she's doing. So during that, I missed a little bit there, but I thought it said on the last $250 million package of replacing all pumps, but we just replaced some pumps at pump station number 1. So I presume we're not talking about replacing those, right?
Your statement is correct, Corky. And it does say replacing 100% of the pumps. What I attempted to say in sort of in color commentary to that one bullet is that it replaces all the big pumps in pump stations 1 and 4. So there are a total of 6, and 4 of the 6 are proposed to be replaced in the $200 million one scenario. All 6 are being proposed to be replaced in the 225 and 250. So I should have said replace 100% of pumps in pump stations 1 and 4.
But we just replaced those pumps in pump station 1.
We did, yeah. So I'm thinking of just the biggest ones. So you replaced 3 out of the 5 in pump station 1. The 2 really big ones, the 700 horsepower pumps, we didn't touch.
All right, thank you. That helps. And then lastly, I think I just wanted to kind of reinforce, I think, some of the comments you already heard, which is converting this, and I think you're already working on this, converting this into, my return on investment for each package size would be really helpful. I suspect that the return on investment, and however you want to say that, however you want to calculate that, is probably significantly higher for the $250 million. But you know, to see that and translate that in a way that the public can grasp would be really helpful. I know that's a really easy thing to do. So
I'll solve world hunger as well.
all right, good, thanks.
I think it's exactly what Corky was getting at, kind of that nuanced question about, well, which pumps is it that if you list these projects out and you have a couple sentences under each that describes what that means, you know, get at all we're asking for. Nancy?
Yeah, this is kind of along the same lines. My God, I think I just disappeared. Stop looking at this screen. So I see in the chat that all of these scenarios include green infrastructure, or like our additional the new mandates by the new legislation under which we are setting up this district talk about green infrastructure. They talk about environmental justice, sense of cultural place, that kind of thing. So what I see in the chat is that will all continue under any of these scenarios. It's just how much, perhaps. And what that makes me think is, number one, I'm not sure we're all talking about the same thing with green infrastructure, and it would be good to talk about that maybe next time. And I guess I'm also wondering, and I do need to talk to Steve about this, but in terms of bringing, Eric and Steve and I have been working together on the guiding principles and some examples. And so if there's time next time, I think it would go well into this kind of discussion, but stay tuned. And I guess I'm wondering, if the watershed plan is not going to be done for 3 years, how would we include some of those projects in this bond measure? It seems like the timing is completely wrong.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nancy. It feels a little bit different than I normally operate, but we are directed to make sure that we include funding and support for all the ORS 550 purposes, which we should be doing, right? So we've talked, this is why Wolf Water Resources was brought in to kind of brainstorm with us of what is green infrastructure, and I would use nature-based solutions, more of a broader term. What does that look like for a flood safety agency? And so we are anticipating that some of those types of projects will be included in the final results of the watershed plan, because they were generic enough and they're fairly accepted measures or efforts to include in designs. And so whether that's wetlands for flood storage, whether it's large woody debris, whether it's X, Y, or Z, these are things that I'm comfortable with, and I'm anticipating that we've kind of already talked about that informally among staff. So it's likely to be in the final watershed plan. And the intent here is to provide some funding towards that end, even though the details aren't there yet. So so that's the background though.
Okay, so then, I mean, I hear that it's going to be in the watershed plan, but I think what was presented to us as a board, I don't know how long ago it was, 4, 6, 8 months, who knows anymore. Carrie and Wolf Water Resources came and gave that presentation, and I thought those were pretty good examples. And so I guess I'd wonder if part of it is, I think it's going to really help the bond sell. And so bond people, consultants, can you, or as a board member, I'm interested in if that's right or not. So if that's part of your research, that would be great. But some of those projects that were already presented to us seem like some good possibilities to include. They're kind of low-hanging fruit. So I'll leave with that. I'll stop.
Thanks, Nancy. Eric Molander.
Yeah, I think important is for us to develop an
Eric, you're kind of cutting out. Do you have something going on with your audio?
Eric, last time this happened, you turned your video off and it was better.
Try it this way. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Very good. All right. So I think that one of the things that we want to have for the public from each level of spending. And so at the $150 million, that raises the levy to 30 feet. That's a once in X or less than a 1% chance or a once in 100-year flood. I think that we need to be able to identify what happens to flood safety and the improvement at that level. Second, I think that we need to start to educate the public about flash flood safety. So am I clear, Tanny?
You're okay. You're not great.
Right. So I've got another way to handle this. So I'm going to let it go on to James, and I'm going to fix my computer. And
it sounds good, Eric. Thank you, James.
Yeah, thanks. We want to capture what you're saying. Appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Eric. Appreciate the comments of the other board members. Appreciate the presentation, and I look forward to future discussions. A couple things I don't need a response to any of these now, but what's on my mind and what I would like to see in the future is similar to Seth's comments. I'm curious to see what percentage or what dollar amount of the $150 million, the $250 million is match to the Corps of Engineers projects. I would like to know, I'm assuming that those projects, we coordinate on them, but they are delivered by the Corps. I think that's an important part of the conversation because I manage a program, we deliver $300 to $400 million every decade, capital program. It's difficult to do all aspects of that work. It's difficult to deliver. And so I'm curious about the time scale. Is this a generational project delivered over 20 years or 30 years? I think Steve mentioned that. And so then what's the generational cost? What's the generational delivery, the time for delivery, and what's the cost? Over how much time? When do we think we would need to go out again? And realistically, what can we deliver? Because the community in civil engineering, the community can't deliver everything that's out there right now. I can tell you that with certainty. So just please be mindful of that, because yesterday I had to write a letter to the city budget office about why we didn't meet our accomplishment rate, why we didn't spend what we borrowed. So just please keep that in mind.
Great comments, James. Eric Mueller.
Yeah, just briefly, I just wanted to follow up on some of Steve's comments and I think Bill's response, but Jamie had mentioned that detailed information or that description of the information that Steve had outlined that Bill said they could put together. Jamie said she'd bring that back at the next board meeting. I just want to be clear, because what I heard Bill say is that he would send it out. And what I want to express is I very much would want that in advance. I don't want to see it for the very first time in this large Brady Bunch scenario, because I don't think it's going to be a productive use of our time to try and digest that for the first time as a group. It'd be useful to look at it and then go through it as a group following. So that's all I wanted to mention. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, and just to be clear, and I appreciate that last thought, it'll take us a little bit of time to package that together. So if we want to do that ahead and then send it out ahead of time, we won't have a chance, y'all won't have a chance to look through that before your next meeting in 2 weeks. It may be in 4 weeks out. So just let us figure out how quickly we can pull that together, but it may be until your mid-April meeting.
Thanks, Bill. Eric and then Ashton.
Okay, so I'm going to attempt this again and turn my video off.
You sound great.
So one of the things that I think that we need to do is tell the public how much more safe they are. So moving to 38 feet in terms of the levee height, that now makes it a once in 200-year flood, once in 500-year flood. We need 500 year, is that what you said? Right, and so we need to be able to say that around the risk from the Columbia River. At the same time, particularly given the events of this past year, we need to understand our pluvine risk, which is for flash flood of conveying water through our system. And are we now safe to a once every 2 year flash flood, once every 5 year flash flood? And by talking about what we're doing to improve the pump stations, we'll be able to give the public and ourselves an understanding of what changes in our capacity and how we're preparing for internal flooding of our district. Is that, those should be readily available numbers, right?
Relatively readily available is to me kind of a loose term, but that's something that we can pull together, Eric.
Okay, thank you.
Ashton.
Thank you, Jim. Quick question, you know, as we think about all the impacts, especially these positives around safety, as we continue to experience climate change, I'd be curious to know the workforce and economic development impacts this will have. This is a pretty large project, and I'm sure a lot of folks will be curious to see how this will impact our workforce, particularly in this region, but more specifically here on the east side.
Great comments, Ashton. Thank you. Tanny?
Hey, as a couple, Steve, you mentioned, a couple others have mentioned, so, you know, having the FEMA projects, the core projects, and other projects that total up this would be helpful. And also, too, having some of those other projects ranked. And if they're not replaced, when would they need to be replaced? What's the priority of each one of those, and how much is it going to cost? And then in these higher packages, obviously we have more infrastructure being replaced. And what is the impact of that on the asset management plan that's in the operating revenue? So if we've got more of these being replaced, we should be able to invest less into that system. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Tanny. Good comments. Makes a lot of sense.
Hey, Steve.
Yes, Jamie.
I just want to clarify one thing. I realized I forgot to mention one part of the last slide. So first I want to say that the input that you provided today is exactly what we were hoping you would provide. It really helps us to inform the fact sheets that we're putting together in our next conversation we'll have. So thank you for plugging in at just the exact way that we needed. The other part is this kind of builds on Emerald's question about when you need to make a decision, and you're making incremental decisions. You know, the first decision we're asking you to make is what's the range of scenarios that you want to bring out and talk to the public about. So that's the conversation we're engaged in now, hopefully, you know, through the end of April. We really would like to engage your communities in May, June, July, so that we can roll up that input, give it back to you in August, so that you can make an initial determination about what package you want to move forward with in August. And then that decision moves into a legal review. You know, there's some work that needs to happen around bond titles and language and all of that, leading to your decision to refer a bond in the November, you know, November-ish timeframe. And again, all that's contingent on what Jim shared, which is, you know, what we're learning about the electoral environment and which, you know, what cycle we're going to go out in. Is it a May or is it a November 2024? So I just want to be clear about what decisions we were asking you to make right now.
Thanks, Jamie. Eric?
Yeah, on that line, Jamie, a question for you. One of the things that we would want to think about is with the timing of some of these will be investments that if we go back to the assets and liability report, they're going to be made 20 years from now. And so one of the things that I would like from your professional advice on is, at what point are we better off saying in 15 years, we're going to go back to the public with a bond plan for the then current ones, as opposed to, we're going to ask you for $200 million today, and we're just going to hang on to that money until we need to spend it 20 years from now. I need to get a sense of what would that really look like.
Eric, that's exactly why I was asking for kind of an idea about schedule for each of the projects, because I do think that's a calculated risk, right? If we put those in the bond package now and it lessens the favorability of the bond by 10 points or something, then no, maybe we want to draw that line to 10 years out and push everything out to another bond package just to increase our chances of success. So that's all really critical info for us to have.
Right. Thank you.
Tanny?
We're also had an initial conversation with our bond financial advisor about how you can structure both the issuance of the debt, the timing of the issuance, which of course will be a board decision, and we'll need to be mindful of arbitrage. If we issued it all and put it in the bank, we could be in trouble. But there's also some ways we can pay off some of the debt and go back to voters with a lower rate and so on. So we've had some initial conversations with our financial advisor about that. And as we start to narrow the range, we should be able to give you a little bit more structured advice about the opportunities and implications of those. But it's expensive to work with that advisor, so we're trying to narrow a little bit before we give you more information on that.
I know folks have to run here at 3 o'clock and we're hitting that mark right now. So we're going to have to go speed round really quickly. Tanny, Nancy, go.
And I realize it's two different roads, but it actually comes down to the same wallet at some point. We've asked these people, you know, would you be willing to fund $350 a month, right? Have we also said, by the way, there's a utility fee plus the $350 a month? And do you think that would have any impact on their decision whether or not to fund?
So the initial polling sort of mixed those two. We didn't go into a lot of detail about operating versus capital, and we know we probably need to investigate that a little more. But what we looked at was the total willingness to pay in the initial research. But yes, there is a combination there, and it's, if not important to the voters, we recognize how important it is to you and the jurisdictions and constituencies you represent to appreciate what the total impact is going to be. And that's why the emphasis on the forecast for the operations are going to be coming back to you just as soon as we can get it done. So excellent question.
Great. Thanks.
Nancy?
I've got my question in the chat and I'm willing to take it offline. So just send it out.
It is a good question real quick. How long is the bond as far as the payment goes? Is that a 10-year payment?
It'll be a decision of the board, and I'm hoping Lori can join in. We think there's a 20 or 30-year payback. The construction window is probably going to be less than that, would be the goal. You're not going to take 30 years to build out all the projects. Right. You'd spend the money before. Lori, did I get that wrong?
No, that's right. We would likely have a 20-year payback on the bond, but we would hopefully fit those projects within a shorter time frame. So you're paying off the bond well after when you've spent the money.
Again, we're dealing with flood risks, so getting the construction done is going to be really important.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I was thinking it was like a 10-year window that we would do the construction and not beyond that.
That's what I was thinking like too, Nancy.
Yeah. Again, depending on capacity and permitting and all the complexities that go into construction, but yes, that's the goal.
Okay, well, we're beyond our time. We lied that we'd be done at 2:50. Sorry about that. But we had a great discussion. I think it was a really, really transparent and important meeting to get this information out. Thank you all.
Great feedback, you guys. We'll get on it.
Thank you. Jim, anything?
No, just I really appreciate the questions. They're excellent questions, and we're going to get to work on bringing you answers. And so thank you all very much for dealing with the time frame and the lack of detail. We're gonna work hard to bring it back to you. So just really appreciate all of you and the approach you took today. Very helpful.
Okay, we're going to officially adjourn the March 16th meeting. Thank you all. We'll see you next time.